They told her humans were fragile, soft things that survived only by hiding behind machines, and Princess Lasura Vare believed it, right up until the moment she met him. The palace trembled under a distant storm, its crystalline walls humming as charged particles scraped across the shield barrier like sand against glass. The sky outside a constant swirl of violet light and silent pressure, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Yet inside the grand corridor, everything remained still, controlled, precise, exactly as her world demanded. And then there was him, standing half a step behind her right shoulder, perfectly positioned but entirely unimpressive. No ceremonial armor, no insignia of rank, just a dark uniform that looked almost too simple for someone assigned to guard a royal heir. His posture relaxed in a way that bordered on disrespect, as if the crushing gravity fluctuations outside meant nothing at all. And that was what bothered her most, not arrogance, but absence. The absence of fear, the absence of effort, the absence of everything that should have marked a capable protector. And when she finally turned her head just enough to study him, really study him, she found nothing to anchor her judgment on. His expression neutral, his breathing steady, his eyes quietly observant but never searching for approval, as though he wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, least of all her, and that alone felt like a challenge. "You are the replacement?" she asked, her voice smooth, measured, carrying the weight of command without raising volume. And he met her gaze only briefly before lowering it again, not submissive, just controlled. "Ethan Cole, ma'am," he replied, his tone even, grounded, unmistakably human, the kind of voice that belonged to someone used to being overlooked, and she almost dismissed him entirely in that moment, almost waved him away as a political token sent by a species eager to impress but unwilling to commit anything of real value. Because in her experience, strength always announced itself. It demanded recognition. It shaped the air around it. But this man did none of those things. He simply stood there while the corridor lights flickered once under the pressure of the storm. And something subtle shifted, not in the room, but in her awareness, a small detail that didn't belong. Because when the lighting dimmed and the temperature dropped nearly 10 degrees in less than a second, every other guard adjusted their stance, micro-movements betraying instinctive recalibration. Yet Ethan Cole did not move at all, not a fraction of an inch, as if the change hadn't registered or didn't matter. And for a brief, unguarded second, Lasara felt it. Not fear, not yet, but curiosity edged with something colder, because creatures that ignored environmental stressors at that level were either unaware or built for far worse. And as the storm outside intensified, sending another wave of pressure through the structure, she found herself asking a question she hadn't intended to voice. "Tell me, human, what kind of world did you come from?" And for the first time, he paused before answering. Not long, just long enough to feel deliberate. "One that doesn't give second chances," he said quietly. And then he went still again, as if the conversation had ended before it truly began, leaving her with a silence that felt heavier than any storm pressing against the palace walls. The corridor did not return to normal after that answer. Even when the storm shifted and the pressure indicators along the walls stabilized into a soft green glow, because something quieter had changed, something that did not belong to the palace systems or the weather outside but lingered in the space between them. And Lasara found herself aware of him in a way she had not intended, not as a guard, not as a political assignment, but as a variable she could not immediately define, which made him dangerous in a way that did not show on any sensor display. And so she moved, not abruptly, not in a way that would signal concern, but with purpose, turning down the eastern gallery where the ceiling rose nearly 60 feet overhead, and the transparent panels revealed the storm in full scale, sheets of charged particles sliding across the barrier like liquid light. The temperature reading hovering just below freezing by human standards, and still. He followed at the same measured distance, footsteps quiet, timing exact, never once breaking formation, and she tested it, subtly at first, adjusting her pace by a fraction, then again, then slowing without warning, and each time he matched her position with mechanical precision, not rushed, not delayed, as though he had already predicted the change before it happened, which irritated her more than it should have, because prediction implied observation, and observation implied intent. and she did not appreciate being studied, especially not by someone she had already dismissed. "You walk as if you have done this your entire life," she said without turning, her voice echoing faintly against the crystalline surfaces, and his reply came without hesitation. "I walk where I am needed." Simple, neutral, unhelpful. The kind of answer that closed doors instead of opening them. And yet there was no defiance in it. Only a quiet boundary that he did not cross. And that, more than anything, unsettled her, because most beings either sought her approval or feared her reaction. But he did neither. He simply existed within the role without trying to reshape it. And as they reached the end of the gallery, the doors ahead parted with a soft hiss, revealing an observation chamber where the environmental field was intentionally weaker. A place designed to let visiting dignitaries experience a controlled fraction of the planet's natural conditions. The air inside thinner, heavier, pressing gently against the lungs, a constant reminder that this world did not accommodate weakness. And she stepped inside without pause, feeling the shift immediately, the subtle resistance in each breath, the way the floor seemed to pull just slightly harder with each step. And behind her, the other guards hesitated for a fraction of a second before entering, their movements adjusting, recalibrating. But Ethan Cole crossed the threshold as if nothing had changed at all, his posture identical, his breathing unchanged. And this time she turned fully, studying him without pretense, allowing the silence to stretch long enough to become a question on its own, because no one moved like that unless they had been shaped by something far less forgiving than this controlled environment. And she spoke again, softer now, more precise. "Most off-worlders require assistance in this chamber." And he met her gaze for just a moment longer than before, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. "Then they should not be here," he said, and the words settled between them with a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. Because it was not arrogance, it was not pride, it was certainty, the kind that came from experience rather than belief. And Lasara felt that cold edge of curiosity sharpen into something more focused. Because she had seen reports, she had studied classifications, she knew the term used by the wider galaxy for worlds that bred resilience through constant pressure, environments where survival was not assumed but earned every single day. And as the storm outside flared again, casting shifting light across his unmoving silhouette, a quiet realization began to form, incomplete but impossible to ignore, that perhaps she had not been given a weak guard at all, but something far more controlled than strength, something that chose not to show itself until there was no other option. The chamber seemed to listen after his words, as if even the environment had registered the quiet certainty behind them. And for the first time since entering, Lysera did not move immediately, her attention fixed not on the storm beyond the glass, but on the human standing within arm's reach. Because there was a pattern forming now, one she could not dismiss as coincidence. The way he occupied space without reacting to it. The way his presence felt anchored even as the world around them shifted. And she decided to push further, not with force, but with precision, stepping deeper into the chamber where the stabilizers weakened by design, where gravity increased by nearly 15% and the air density fluctuated just enough to strain unprepared lungs. A place intended to remind visiting officials that this planet demanded respect. And she stopped near the far edge, where the transparent wall curved outward and the storm pressed closest, the field humming audibly now, a low vibration that traveled through the floor and into bone. And behind her, she heard it, subtle but unmistakable, the faint adjustment in the breathing of her own guards, the shift in stance as they compensated. And then there was Ethan Cole, still as before, his silhouette unchanged, his breathing steady, his balance perfect, as though the additional force had been anticipated long before he entered the room. And she turned slowly, allowing the silence to stretch again, but this time it felt different, not empty, but charged with unspoken recognition. "You have been here before," she said, not as a question but as a statement, because nothing else explained it. No training simulation could replicate this level of adaptation, and he shook his head once, a small motion, controlled. "No, ma'am," he replied, and that should have ended it. But it did not, because the answer only deepened the contradiction, and she took a step closer, closing the distance deliberately, her gaze searching his face for anything that resembled strain, fatigue, hesitation, anything that would anchor him back into the category she understood. But there was nothing, only that same quiet focus, and something colder settled into her thoughts. Because she had read the classifications, she knew the designation used by Interstellar Command for certain worlds, environments where pressure, temperature, and unpredictability combined into something that reshaped every organism that survived there, worlds where adaptation was not optional but constant, where failure was not corrected but removed, and beings that came from such places were marked not by visible strength, but by absence of limitation. And she spoke again, more carefully now. Then your body should be reacting. And this time he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting briefly past her toward the storm, as if measuring something she could not see. And when he spoke, his voice was softer, almost reflective. "It is reacting," he said, and she felt a slight tightening in her chest, not from the environment, but from the implication behind those words. Because if this was his body reacting, then whatever baseline he carried was far beyond what her world demanded. And the realization settled into place with quiet inevitability, not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable, that she had misjudged him from the very beginning, not because he had hidden anything, but because she had been looking for the wrong signs, expecting strength to announce itself in ways she recognized, when in truth it had been standing beside her all along, controlled, contained, and entirely uninterested in proving itself. And as the storm outside surged again, casting shifting light across the chamber, she understood something else, something far more unsettling, that whatever limits this human possessed, they were not being tested here, not even close. And for the first time, the silence between them did not feel like absence, but restraint. The restraint did not go unnoticed, and once seen, it could not be unseen, because it reframed everything, every still movement, every measured breath, every moment he chose not to act, and Lasara felt it settle into her awareness like a quiet weight. The realization that what she had taken for passivity might in fact be control, and control implied capacity, far beyond what had been displayed. And she turned away from him not out of dismissal this time, but to think, her gaze shifting back to the storm where the outer field flickered for just a fraction of a second, a brief distortion in the light that most would have ignored, but she did not, because anomalies in a system like this were never accidental, and she felt it before she heard it, a subtle shift in the vibration beneath her feet, the hum of the stabilizers dropping by a narrow margin, not enough to trigger alarms, not enough to alert the outer guard units, but enough to matter, enough to change the equation. And behind her, the other guards reacted, their posture tightening, their attention sharpening, hands moving closer to their equipment without fully committing, because protocol dictated restraint until confirmation. But Ethan Cole did not reach for anything. He did not adjust. He did not even look toward the source of the fluctuation, and that, more than the disturbance itself, drew her attention back to him. Because it was not ignorance, it was timing, the kind that suggested he had already accounted for whatever was about to happen, and the air shifted again, this time more noticeably, the pressure rising another increment, the lights dimming just slightly as energy rerouted through the system, and a faint line appeared along the far edge of the transparent barrier, not a break, not yet, but a stress point, a place where the storm pressed harder than the field could comfortably sustain, and Lasara felt the calculation form instantly in her mind: distance, response time, structural tolerance, and she stepped back without thinking, just enough to create space, and the guards moved with her, tightening formation, but Ethan remained exactly where he was, positioned between her and the developing fault line, without ever being told to do so, his stance unchanged, his focus forward. And in that moment, she understood something with absolute clarity. He had not been reacting because he had already placed himself where he needed to be before the situation required it. And the chamber grew quieter, not in sound but in tension, the kind that built without announcement, the kind that turned seconds into something heavier. And she spoke, not as a test this time, but as a genuine question. "Did you know?" And he answered in the same calm tone. "I expected a weakness," he said, and there was no pride in it. No attempt to impress, just a statement of observation. And the line along the barrier shimmered again, slightly wider now, the storm pressing closer, the system compensating, holding, but only just, and Lasara felt a flicker of something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, but awareness of risk, real risk, the kind that did not announce itself loudly but revealed itself in small, precise failures. And she looked at him again, truly looked this time, not at the uniform, not at the absence of rank, but at the way he stood, the way he had always been. Standing, and she realized that whatever was coming next, whatever this system was about to demand, he had already decided how much of himself he would allow it to see. And for the first time since he arrived, she did not question whether he was enough. She questioned how much he was choosing not to show. The chamber did not fail all at once, and that was what made it dangerous, because failure that arrived slowly gave the illusion of control, and Lasara felt that illusion begin to fracture as the faint line along the barrier deepened into something more defined, a narrow distortion where light bent just slightly out of alignment, the storm pressing against it with patient force, not violent, not chaotic, but persistent, as if the world outside had all the time it needed to test the limits of what stood in its way, and the system responded as designed, redistributing energy, stabilizing pressure, adjusting temperature in precise increments. Yet each correction came a fraction of a second later than it should have, and those fractions began to add up, stacking into something noticeable, something measurable, and the guards shifted again, this time with less subtlety, their formation tightening, their attention fixed on the barrier, waiting for a command that had not yet been given. Because protocol required confirmation before escalation, but Lasara could feel it, the narrowing margin between stability and compromise, and she stepped back another pace, not out of fear but calculation, creating distance from the fault line, and as she did, Ethan Cole moved for the first time in a way that broke his previous stillness, not rushed, not abrupt, just one step, precisely placed, positioning himself directly between her and the distortion, his body aligned with the stress point, as though he had drawn a line no one else could see, and she watched him closely now, every detail, every shift in balance, every subtle adjustment that had been invisible before but now carried meaning, and the air changed again, the pressure increasing enough to register even in her own breathing, a slight resistance with each inhale, the kind that would fatigue untrained lungs over time, and still he remained unchanged, his breathing steady, his posture grounded, and she spoke again, quieter. Now, not to test him, but to understand him. If it breaks, she said, her voice low against the hum of the failing stabilizer, what happens next? And he did not look at her when he answered, his focus remaining on the barrier, on the precise point where the distortion wavered. Then we manage the exposure, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not casual, not dismissive, but practiced, as though this was not a hypothetical to him, as though he had already lived through scenarios where systems failed and the environment took over, and the realization settled deeper into her thoughts. Because this was not just adaptation, this was familiarity, and she felt a flicker of something she had not expected to feel toward him, not respect yet, but recognition, the kind that came when a variable stopped being abstract and became real, and the barrier shimmered again, more visibly now, the line widening by a measurable fraction, the system pushing back harder, the hum rising in pitch, and the guards finally broke protocol, one of them stepping forward, voice tense but controlled. Your Highness, we recommend evacuation. And Lasara did not answer immediately, her gaze still fixed on Ethan, because he had not moved, had not reacted to the suggestion, had not even acknowledged it, and that silence spoke louder than any warning, because it meant he did not see evacuation as the immediate solution, and that alone shifted her decision, and she raised a hand slightly, a subtle command to hold position, and the guard fell silent, though the tension remained, thick in the air, and she spoke once more, not to the room, not to the system, but to him. You are not concerned, she said, and this time he turned his head just enough to meet her gaze, his expression unchanged, but there was something there now, something she had not seen before, not emotion, not exactly, but clarity. I am, he replied, and the honesty in it was absolute, unfiltered. That is why I am here. And the words settled into the space between them with a weight that shifted everything. Because concern did not drive him away from the threat, it placed him directly in front of it, and as the barrier flickered once more, the line holding by a margin that grew thinner with every passing second. Lasara understood that whatever happened next, he would not step aside, not because he was ordered to remain, but because he had already decided that this was the point where he would stop holding back. The chamber held its breath as the system reached the edge of its tolerance, the hum of the stabilizers rising into a thin, almost fragile tone that vibrated through the floor and into the ribs, and Lasara could feel the exact moment when containment stopped being guaranteed and became negotiation. The barrier no longer a certainty, but a promise under strain, and the distortion along its surface sharpened into a visible seam. Light bending and warping as the storm pressed closer, a constant force measured in pressure and persistence rather than speed, and the air shifted again, heavier now, the kind that made every movement deliberate, every breath something to be chosen rather than taken, and behind her, the guards adjusted once more, their discipline holding but their limits beginning to show in the smallest ways, a slight delay in response, a fraction of hesitation in their stance, while Ethan Cole remained unchanged, his position fixed, his balance centered, as though the environment had finally reached a level that matched something internal rather than exceeded it, and that thought settled into her mind with quiet certainty, because this was not where he struggled, this was where he became precise, and the seam along the barrier flickered, widening by less than an inch, but enough to let something through, not the storm itself, not fully, but a trace of it. A whisper of external pressure slipping into the chamber, the temperature dropping sharply, the air thinning just enough to sting the lungs, and the system reacted instantly, redirecting power, reinforcing the field, but the delay remained, that fractional lag that turned response into reaction, and Lasara felt it, the shift from control to endurance, and she took a breath that did not come as easily as before, her body adapting, but not without effort, and she saw it then, not in him, but around him. The way the air moved differently at his position, the way the incoming pressure seemed to meet resistance. That did not belong to the system, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real, as if his presence alone altered how the environment behaved, not through force, but through alignment, and she spoke without thinking, her voice lower now, steadier despite the strain. "What are you doing?" And he answered without looking back, his focus fixed on the seam, on the exact point where the barrier struggled to hold. "Nothing extra," he said. And the words should have been dismissive, but they were not. They were exact, because what he was doing was not an action added to the situation. It was a baseline he had brought with him, something constant that did not need to be activated, and the seam pulsed again, the incoming pressure increasing just enough to force the system into another adjustment, the lights dimming briefly as power shifted, and this time Lasara felt her footing change slightly, the floor pressing harder against her weight, the environment asserting itself in a way that could not be ignored, and she took a half step back, not retreating, but recalibrating, and Ethan moved again, not stepping away from the seam, but angling his stance by a fraction, positioning himself between her and the direction of the incoming force with a precision that suggested instinct refined by repetition, and the realization completed itself in her mind, not as a question, but as a fact, that he was not waiting to react to failure. He was already managing it, already reducing its impact before it could reach her, and the guards saw it too now, their attention shifting from the barrier to him, uncertainty replacing protocol, because this was outside their training, outside their expectations, and the chamber grew quieter still, the hum thinning, the pressure holding at a level that should have continued to rise but did not, and Lasara felt it, the change in trajectory, subtle but undeniable, as if the situation had been redirected without announcement, and she looked at him fully, no longer searching for weakness, no longer measuring capability, but recognizing something else entirely, something far more controlled than strength, and as the seam along the barrier steadied, no longer widening, no longer collapsing, she understood that the system had not solved the problem. It had been given time, and that time had come from him, from the choice he had made to stand exactly where he was, and to allow only as much of the situation to unfold as he was willing to permit. The change did not arrive with a sound, but with absence, the hum of the stabilizers lowering by a fraction, the pressure no longer climbing, the seam along the barrier holding its shape instead of widening. And for a moment it felt as though the chamber had stepped out of a downward spiral and into something balanced, not stable, not safe, but controlled, and Lasara stood there, feeling the difference in her own body. The way her breathing no longer fought the air, the way the floor beneath. Her feet stopped pressing harder with each passing second, and she understood what that meant, not in theory, but in reality. The trajectory had changed, the outcome was no longer inevitable, and she looked at him again. Really looked this time, not searching, not questioning, but observing with clarity, because whatever he was doing, whatever he was choosing to allow or deny, it had altered the environment itself, not by overwhelming it, not by forcing it into submission, but by meeting it at a level it recognized, and that realization carried a weight that settled deep, because it meant he was not reacting to the world around him. He was calibrated to it, shaped by something that made this level of pressure feel familiar rather than extreme, and the guards felt it too, their posture easing by a fraction, confusion replacing urgency, because their instruments still showed instability, still indicated risk. Yet their senses told a different story, and that contradiction left them uncertain, caught between protocol and perception, and one of them finally spoke again, quieter this time, less certain. Your Highness, the readings are still outside acceptable parameters, and Lasara did not answer immediately, her attention still on Ethan, because the readings no longer held the same authority they had moments ago, not when reality itself had shifted in a way they could not explain, and she stepped forward, closing the distance until she stood just behind him, close enough to feel the difference in the air around him, subtle but undeniable, a pocket of steadiness where the pressure seemed to settle rather than fluctuate, and she spoke, not as a command, not as a test, but as an acknowledgement forming in real time. You are controlling the outcome, and this time he turned slightly, just enough for her to see his expression clearly, still calm, still measured, but there was something else now, something that had not been present before, not emotion, not exactly, but permission, the kind that came when someone chose to let you understand a truth they had been holding back. I am limiting it, he said, and the distinction mattered, because control implied dominance, while limitation implied restraint, and that word settled into her thoughts with quiet precision, reframing everything she had seen since he arrived, every moment he had chosen not to act, not because he could not, but because he did not need to, and the seam along the barrier shimmered again. But this time it did not grow, it did not spread, it held, and the system adjusted, catching up, reinforcing, stabilizing in increments that finally aligned with the demand being placed on it. And Lasara felt something shift inside her, not fear, not even relief, but recognition, the kind that came when a misconception collapsed and revealed something far more complex beneath it, and she spoke again. Softer now, almost to herself. You were never struggling. And he did not respond, not because he disagreed, but because there was nothing to add, and the silence that followed was different from before, not empty, not uncertain, but full, filled with understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. And as the chamber continued to stabilize, as the pressure settled into manageable levels, and the seam along the barrier faded back into the surface, becoming once again just another part of the transparent wall, Lasara realized that the danger had not been removed. It had been managed, shaped, reduced to something the system could handle, and that had not been the work of the palace, or the guards, or the protocol she had trusted her entire life. It had been him, standing exactly where he needed to be, choosing exactly how much of himself to reveal, and for the first time since he arrived, she understood that what she had mistaken for weakness had never been absence of strength, but the presence of discipline so absolute that it could hold back an entire world without ever needing to prove that it could. The chamber did not return to what it had been, and Lasara knew it never would, because once a system revealed its limits, it could not pretend to be absolute again, and once a person revealed restraint at that scale, they could not be mistaken for ordinary, and she stood there in the quiet that followed, feeling the last remnants of pressure ease from the air. The stabilizers settling into a steady hum that no longer trembled at the edge of failure, and the seam along the barrier fading completely, leaving only the illusion of perfection behind, as though nothing had happened at all, and yet everything had changed, because the guards had seen it. Even if they did not fully understand it, their posture no longer rigid with protocol, but subtly adjusted. Their awareness now split between the environment and the human who had altered it. And Lasara felt that shift ripple through the room, not commanded, not announced, but real, a recalibration of hierarchy that did not need words to take hold. And she stepped back slowly, not retreating, but creating space, giving herself distance to observe him without the immediate pressure of the situation. And Ethan Cole did something equally subtle. He stepped back as well, returning to the exact position he had held before any of this began, as if the entire event had been an interruption rather than a defining moment. His posture once again neutral, his presence once again quiet, and that contrast struck her more deeply than anything else, because it meant that what she had just witnessed was not his peak, not his limit, but a controlled response scaled to the need of the moment. And she spoke again, her voice steady, measured, but no longer carrying the same edge it had before. "It is over." And he nodded once. "A small, precise motion, for now," he replied, and the words settled with a meaning that extended beyond the chamber, beyond the storm, beyond the system that had nearly failed, because they implied continuity, awareness, readiness. And she realized then that he had never seen this as a single event, never treated it as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger pattern, one he was already prepared to navigate. And the guards began to move, cautiously at first, re-establishing their positions, checking instruments, confirming what their senses already told them, that the environment had stabilized within acceptable limits. And yet their attention continued to drift back to him, as though they could not fully trust the numbers without acknowledging the factor that had changed them. And Lasara turned toward the exit, the doors responding instantly to her presence, sliding open with a soft hiss. And she paused for a fraction of a second before stepping through, not out of hesitation, but consideration, because something within her had shifted, something fundamental, and she spoke without turning, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without addressing the room. "You chose how much to reveal," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no challenge, only recognition. And behind her, his response came in the same calm tone she had come to recognize as deliberate. "I chose what was necessary," he said, and that distinction settled into her thoughts with quiet finality, because necessity implied judgment, restraint, discipline, all of the things she had once mistaken for absence. And she stepped forward, leaving the chamber behind, the storm still raging beyond the walls, unchanged, relentless, but no longer the dominant force in her perception, because now she understood something she had not before, that power was not always measured by what it could do, but by what it chose not to do. And as the doors closed behind her, sealing the chamber once more into controlled silence, she knew that whatever assumptions she had carried into that room had been left behind, replaced by something far more precise, far more dangerous, and far more human. The corridor beyond the chamber felt different, not because the architecture had changed, but because Lasara had, the polished surfaces reflecting the same controlled light, the distant hum of the palace systems steady and precise. Yet every detail now carried a new layer of meaning, a quiet reminder that perfection was maintained, not guaranteed. And she walked with measured steps, aware of the presence behind her, no longer dismissing it as routine, no longer reducing it to obligation, because Ethan Cole did not follow like the others. He did not mirror the formation, did not project readiness through visible tension. He simply moved, steady, aligned, present in a way that no longer felt empty. And that presence filled the silence between them with something deliberate, something chosen. And she slowed her pace without announcing it, allowing the distance between them to narrow by a fraction, testing not his reaction, but her own understanding. And as expected, he adjusted seamlessly, not closing the gap too quickly, not lagging behind, but maintaining that exact position he seemed to define rather than follow. And she stopped near a narrow observation window set into the wall, far smaller than the chamber they had left, offering only a partial view of the storm outside, a controlled glimpse rather than an immersive experience. And she looked out at it, the swirling mass of charged particles moving with relentless consistency, a force that did not tire, did not hesitate, did not choose. It simply existed. And for the first time, she did not measure it as the dominant power in the equation, because she had seen something that did choose, something that decided how much of that force would be allowed to matter, and she spoke without turning, her voice softer now, stripped of the formal edge it once carried. "On your world," she said, "is it always like this?" And there was a pause behind her, not hesitation, but consideration, the kind that suggested the answer was not simple. "Worse," he said finally, and the word did not carry exaggeration, it carried memory, and she felt that again, that quiet shift in her perception, because worse implied survival under conditions beyond what she had just experienced, beyond what her people considered extreme. And she turned then, fully, facing him without pretense, without distance, her gaze steady, searching not for weakness, but for truth, and she asked the question that had been forming since the moment the chamber began to fail. "Why did you not show it sooner?" And the silence that followed was not empty. It was deliberate, shaped, held for just long enough to give the answer weight. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, unchanged, but the meaning behind it settled deeper than anything he had said before. "Because you did not need it sooner," he said, and the simplicity of it carried a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, no hidden motive, no performance, just necessity and restraint. And Lysara felt something settle into place within her, something final, because that answer did not elevate him above her, did not challenge her authority. It simply revealed a truth she had not considered, that strength was not meant to be displayed for recognition, but reserved for when it was required. And she held his gaze for a moment longer, not as a princess assessing a guard, but as one being recognizing another on equal terms. And then she turned back to the window, the storm still moving beyond the glass, unchanged, unending, and yet no longer absolute. And she did not speak again, because there was nothing left to say that would add to what had already been understood. And behind her, Ethan Cole resumed his position without a sound, without a shift in presence, as if nothing had happened, as if everything had remained exactly the same. And that was when she realized the final truth, not in words, not in explanation, but in the silence that followed them down the corridor, that he had never needed to prove anything at all, because the moment had already spoken for him, and it had chosen silence.